Welcome back. And in today's video, we're going to discuss proof-of-work systems versus proof-of-stake systems and try to understand them in a broader sense, removing ourselves from the technical computer science behind them. Now, before we begin, I want to give credit to the many people whose thoughts and knowledge on governmental systems and psychology have inspired this video, from James Lavish, Preston Pysh, Jeff Booth, to name a few. It is also heavily inspired by Jason Lowery's work on this subject, and I highly recommend following him on Twitter and keeping an eye out for the book and his thesis that he is going to come out with in the near future. And with that being said, let's get into it. First, to understand these systems better, I think you need to start with the broad question: how do we allocate resources, control authority, and reach consensus on legitimate ownership of property? In the past and in the present, pack animals would distribute food and resources to those who were the most powerful among them, based on strength and fighting abilities. Humans used to do this too, but then we started creating imaginary power structures with abstract power. This means that power and authority were no longer determined by physical capabilities, but rather an abstract form of power. This is well documented in history, as we have records of people being worshipped and buried in pyramids with gold-plated caskets and other privileges that they had throughout their whole entire lives. These humans had such imaginary powers that they were treated and worshipped like gods. And these god kings, per se, had all the power. If there were disputes over property rights, these god kings would determine the outcome. However, these people did not actually have any power. Rather, it was just an abstraction, because these people were most likely not gods, and there is no proof that they were. Now, let's use an example to illustrate this point. A small dog barking at a big dog that it could not possibly defeat in any physical fight. Now, why is a small dog barking at the bigger dog? Well, it is a warning to the other dog that it is prepared to impose a physically prohibitive cost on it, and it will protect its territory. In other words, it is a form of deterrence. Like if you were to pull up your shirt to reveal a gun, which shows you have the ability to impose a physically prohibitive cost on your attacker. When it comes to dogs, it can be amusing to us because we have deliberately bred them to be docile, removing all aggression. But this gives us evidence to believe that giving up our power or the ability to secure ourselves by imposing physically prohibitive costs on our attackers leads to a direct decrease in our security and overall well-being. Another way to summarize this point is that if you remove aggression or the ability to impose physically prohibitive costs on those who may wish to harm you, you forfeit some security. A great example of this is domesticated animals, who are less secure because we have bred them to be docile and removed their ability to impose those costs on us. As a result, we can eat them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. And I believe that this idea can be extrapolated to broader issues. For example, if you use a different protocol than proof of power, you risk systemic exploitation because that is what domestication represents. The goal of domestication and its foundation is the newfound ability to exploit these creatures and take advantage of them by removing their capacity to impose physically prohibitive costs on us. Because of our ability to think abstractly, humans were able to think philosophically and have ideologies. As a result, it became morally reprehensible to use proof of power on the basis for determining resource allocation, property rights, and achieving consensus on the legitimate state of ownership rights. Using proof of power to determine these things was morally condemned because it requires a lot of energy and is incredibly difficult. Like wolves constantly fighting amongst themselves to determine a hierarchy. You also risk physical harm if you use proof of power to determine these hierarchies, as both parties risk physical injury and even death. This can be seen in pack animals that determine the legitimate state of ownership through power by fighting with each other, but have learned to pull their punches in order to determine these things without fighting to the death. This idea is consistent among most animals, including humans, because we naturally do not want to impose lethal costs on our fellow species. So, in summary, humans have a strong inclination not to use physical power as the basis for determining who gets to control resources and achieve consensus on the legitimate state of ownership. We instead use an abstract form of power that does not require as much energy and does not cause injury. That is the main reason why we adopted these systems of abstract power hierarchies. Now, we have established that when you take the will to fight out of animals, they become systemically exploitable. The same thing happened when society adopted these abstract power hierarchies, as these god kings exploited their populations. And we see this even in the present today, in places like North Korea, where it is a trust-based system in which you must trust your God King, while at the same time often removing the constraints on their power. The dangers of this can be seen throughout many times in history, as it is a magnification of something seen in nature. In a wolf pack, you see a wolf pack leader, and it only has control over what it is physically capable of controlling. With abstract power, there is theoretically no limit to the control that a leader may have, because people give that leader the abstract ability to expand control with no marginal cost. And this applies to not just a singular leader like a president or a dictator, but also to large institutions within countries. Now, let's bring this to the present and try to make some sense of it. Today, we have many physical resources, and one example is the surface area of the Earth, which all humans seem to value a lot. The question then arises, how do we determine resource control authority over the surface area of the Earth and determine the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody over the same surface area of the Earth? Now, as someone with no knowledge of the world or how it works, you might look at the Earth and see that humans do not have centralized control over the surface area of the Earth, but rather we have a decentralized system. We do this using large-scale physical power projection. There is no one nation or authority that has complete control over the Earth's resources because humans deliberately prohibit that, imposing a physically prohibitive cost on gaining control and authority over the surface area of the Earth. And we see this currently in Russia and Ukraine, where there is a cost in terms of war and death and the money that it costs to make all of these weapons and machinery and to carry out big, large-scale territory gains or losses in war. And that is the result of Russia trying to gain resource control authority over Ukraine's land. So effectively, we use the proof of work protocol by using physical power and having large-scale physical competition. The benefit of using this large-scale power competition at a global level is decentralization of control authority over Earth's natural resources. This can also be seen in times when people like Genghis Khan and Hitler tried to gain centralized control and authority over Earth's natural resources. The reason this system is secure is because there is no limit to how much power regular people can sum together to make it physically cost prohibitive to achieve centralized control and authority over the resources. Physical power is also very inclusive, meaning anyone can participate in the system because anyone can fight or throw a punch, etc. There is theoretically no limit to how much power well-meaning people can sum together. Now, this system, whether you call it proof of power or use physical watts as an example, is exogenous, meaning it cannot be systemically exploited, whereas rank can be exploited and changed. Someone could change their rank or change the meaning or powers of their rank if it is upheld by the system. It can be systemically exploited. Physical power, on the other hand, is naturally decentralized and easily validated. But the two downsides, as we mentioned earlier, are that it is very energy intensive and can cause injury. However, if physical power was extremely energy efficient and had no capacity to cause injury, like in an electric form, it could be highly systemically secure protocol and not ideologically bad on any philosophical grounds because it is so good at preventing systemic exploitation. Now, physical power is fairly inclusive. Abstract power is usually not very inclusive. There is usually one person at the top and the others do not have the access to that power, making it non-inclusive and therefore not fully representative compared to proof of power / work. It is also impossible to validate and is only noticed and agreed upon when others validate your abstract power. However, it is meaningless if they do not adhere to your abstract power hierarchies. Some of the positives of abstract power are that it is highly energy efficient, and if there is a well-functioning, trustworthy society, and everyone is fair, it can work extremely well. But the root problem with abstract power is that it relies entirely on the trust that people will follow the rules and not take advantage of any of the systems in place. Now, I'd love to live in a world like that, but history is full of examples of people breaking that trust over and over again. And I can't emphasize enough that our systems are trust-based systems, and if that trust breaks, the system completely falls. It is also systemically insecure because as long as you can rely on abstract power, you are technically powerless from a physical standpoint because you have no capacity to impose severe, physically prohibitive costs on people who try to invade or exploit you. And another problem with these systems is that the incentives are completely misaligned, with sociopaths and power-hungry individuals incentivized to climb these ladders to gain more control and potentially exploit you. And just naturally, people like that will be attracted to these positions. And it is much easier to exploit people through abstract power than it is through physical power. Now, bringing it back to the scenario with the wolves, although they are constantly fighting, that alpha wolf is not capable of exploiting the pack compared to if they used abstract power. This system is much more of a meritocracy. Now, digging into some of the basics of computer science and its relation to proof of work and proof of stake, I am no expert in this field, but I'm just trying to give a very surface level, basic understanding to understand these topics a little bit better. Now, these examples are some of the ways that Jason Lowery explains these basic computer science principles. So he begins by saying, a computer is a general purpose state machine, a machine whose state can be changed. State machines are named after their function, not their form, to compute something. Now, programming can be thought of like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where the story does not actually exist, but rather it is a figment of his imagination. He writes it down with a complex language, so it is now not only in his head, but on paper. Even if it is acted out and made into a great movie, that does not make it any more real. It is still a figment of his imagination. And computer programming is similar in that way, as we humans have an idea and then write it down using complex computer programming languages that the machines can read, and then they effectively role-play with the script. At no point does the program actually physically exist, but just the medium in which it exists changes. If I load a program on my electronic computer, nothing physically changes, but the state of the machine changes. So programming is just the symbolic meaning that you can apply to the change of this state machine. Everything you see on a computer screen is a symbolic representation of what is in someone's brain that a state machine is acting out for you. And this relates to Bitcoin because we will be discussing the topic of real, actual energy expenditure and how proof of work enables that, compared to proof of stake, where there is no real tie to reality. It's important also to note that software is never broken. It is only taken advantage of. When you talk about software, the admin or developer is the quote-unquote God King because they have the most control over the software in the abstract power hierarchy. There is no abstract reality, like data and numbers, and legit reality, like the hardware that is used and defended by fences and armed guards. So what happens when you have a huge honeypot of abstract power, where you can impact everyone's computers in the world, like Facebook, but you have no true ability to impose physically prohibitive costs on your attackers? The problem is you can't impose physically prohibitive costs in and from cyberspace, at least not until Adam Bach and Hashcash. To solve a hash, there is a physically prohibitive cost of energy consumption. With Hashcash, you receive a receipt that proves you have done this work and expended this physical energy and computer computation. An example of why this is important is in cybersecurity. If you are getting spammed with emails or requests, it is only possible because there is no marginal cost to additional emails being sent or requests. It is very cheap for someone to do this. But if you impose a physically prohibitive cost or force on them, you are imposing a cost on someone who is taking advantage of your abstract power with software. Proof of work is reverse hypothesization, where you can take a real thing, being watts, and treat it as an abstract receipt. Now that we can take a system where real-world things can impose a real-world cost on people for verification and secure some sort of network, the question arises, who gets to control that? And would that person then become a God King? Well, we can't speak for every scenario, but in the case of Bitcoin, Satoshi, Bitcoin's creator, designed the protocol to be secured by its own hash function, which is a self-reinforcing loop. The beauty of Bitcoin is that when deciding who should control authority over the ledger, Satoshi made it so the people who solve the hash cost function can determine that ledger. And what's great about that is that watts are everywhere on the earth. So it is decentralized in that sense. It is also unbound because watts are infinitely available. So therefore, honest people can summon up to no limit so that no one could gain 51% of the hash power without significant pushback. But people condemn proof of work because of the expense of power. But the use of energy is the innovation in this process. The reverse hypothesization is the evolution in cybersecurity and, in Bitcoin's form, money. Proof of stake says we can use an abstract form of power that can fulfill the role of physical power without having to expend anything. Because proof of stake is bound in zero sum, honest people cannot gain more power. They are stuck. All objects in software do not physically exist, so it is physically impossible for it to be verifiably decentralized because it's not a real thing. It comes back to a trust-based system. You have to have trust that they're saying that it's decentralized. And with Ethereum, they say that they can solve this problem with slashing. But then how can you reach legitimate consensus on who to slash in scenarios like the Canadian trucker protests? How can everyone agree on who should be slashed out of the system or not? The answer is that'll never happen. You can never get a unanimous or vast majority vote on who to or not to slash in an abstract form. The point is, whatever you do, don't let people lose the ability to physically defend their access to their property using real-world physical power. Condemn it as much as possible, and once they start using your abstract power hierarchy, then these people who created these abstract power hierarchies have the power to exploit the now domesticated financial users. In conclusion, I think it's important to understand that proof of work is a power projection tool to impose the physical costs across cyberspace, and in turn can be used to create some of the most secure systems ever created. It just so happens that it makes for an incredibly secure and useful monetary system in the form of Bitcoin as well. Now that's it. That's all I got for you guys today. Thank you for sticking with this long, drawn-out analogy. I hope you got some value from it. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.